record on this computer. So welcome in again. It is Tuesday, June 28th, 2022. Welcome to the end of the world. Today we are going to pick up where I left off last time, where I didn't really get to the rhetorical analysis as fully as I wanted to, and I didn't really get to introduce fallacies at all. So we'll start off today by taking a somewhat shallow, let's call it a swan dive into the medium end of the pool. And we'll start talking about fallacies, some fundamental concepts about fallacies, and we'll focus, I've kind of broken fallacies up into 5 different categories. Not a problem, Mike. We'll talk about these different categories today in broad strokes, but then we'll really focus on one of these categories, and we'll talk about fallacies of relevance. I've split these into categories of fallacies of relevance, presumption, defective, induction, ambiguity, and just other fallacies. For reasons that will become clear in a little bit when we start talking about them, there are many more versions of fallacies than it's probably possible to name. There are infinite ways of being wrong. There's only one way of saying true things truly, generally speaking. Grammatically, you can reformulate sentences in a bunch of different ways, but a sentence is true or it's false, but there are infinite ways a sentence can be false, or that there are infinite ways of combinations of things that you get. You'll also see that a lot of the fallacies don't have really strong boundaries between them, that one fallacy could probably qualify as more than one type of fallacy. You'll also see that the tendency, once you start seeing one fallacy and a second fallacy, they kind of start to build up, and you might notice that, oh, one sort of naturally leads to maybe the presence of the other. So there's not a clear distinction between some of these. And there's, depending on what logician you're talking to on what day of the week, everybody's got a slightly different way of categorizing the broad types of fallacies. And then in the second hour, what we'll do is we'll turn to rhetorical analysis, and we'll talk in particular about Sanders and Walsh, the readings for today. And I think right off the bat, I've got some great examples of maybe fallacies that are going on in Walsh, at least. I've got some criticisms of Bernie Sanders, bless his quickly aging heart. But we'll look at both of their arguments. We'll look at sort of take a walk through all of the different rhetorical strategies and how those are going on in both of those. So I gotta pull up rhetorical analysis real quick. There we go. One thing I want to do before we jump in is, although I haven't had a chance to read all of, or I haven't had a chance to score all of the discussion threads that were due today, I did take a chance to look through them just to kind of get a baseline of where everybody's at. And more often than not, I was seeing exactly what I wanted to see, which is, again, great stuff. What I really like, there seemed to be people sort of aggregated around Cheryl Strayed and Chris Riora, which is really interesting. But there was a little bit of space given to a little bit of everybody. And one of the things I really enjoyed about sort of going through these really quickly is seeing how different people read the same piece of rhetoric and took different emotions away from them. And most of the time I got very specific emotions. And that's exactly what I was looking for, was just sort of give me some context, talk about some emotion and show me some language, and then explain why that language is doing that thing, right? Some were more explicit than others, right? But I got some things in Cheryl Stray, some emotions that were evoked out of that passage were determination, passion, empathy, humility, relief, accomplishment, intensity, painfulness, relief again, passion again, and excitement. And I really like that there's not too much overlap. Some people were noticing some similar stuff, but then at the same time, I liked the idea that in Strayed, somebody got very specifically determination, or a couple of people got determination. It's just a different sort of, and not any one of those is more correct than the other, right? It's just how are you pointing to language, and how are you justifying the thing that you felt while you were reading it, and why you think that the author was trying to evoke that. Same thing with Riora. Popular ones, I got empowerment, pride, happiness, confidence, pride again, pride's pretty popular. This one was interesting. Katie, you talked about how he seemed like sort of offensive. You felt almost like he was insulting somebody, that he was being kind of degrading, and but also there's this sense of respect that he's also showing for like the craft itself. I thought that was really interesting. And I think that was all we worry about. Only one person talked about Brooks, poor David Brooks, and his discontentment, which I think that's a really great word to throw out about it. Misty, whenever you were in your response to Karen's discussion of Sedaris, which Sedaris had some good ones too, you talked about repugnance, that which is a really good word, and disgust, right? That was another thing I got out of Sedaris a bunch: disappointment, disgust, shame. And again, all of these are like I said, there's a little bit of overlap in some of these, but a lot of these were like really, really unique and interesting. Sometimes I had to, sometimes, students stated an emotion outright. Sometimes I had to do a little distillation, right? Sometimes somebody would be like, the author makes me feel sorry for him, right? And that it's, but distilling that feeling sorry for himness down into something like shame, guilt, sadness, right? Even all of those words like have a little bit different shades of meaning, where sadness is probably the most general. Shame and guilt, pretty specific, maybe even implying each other in some sense. Or maybe not. Maybe you can feel guilty without feeling shame. That's an interesting question. But you can definitely feel sad without feeling shame. You just kind of feel, maybe it's just kind of Monday in November, so I thought that was really good. And also I wanted to take a second to talk about what it's going to look like, because I have scored some of the proposals, and I kind of wanted to talk about like what you are going to see whenever you get your proposals back. So I'll go into, I'll share my screen real quick. And this is from the student preview mode. So this is kind of what it looks like whenever you log in. So if you go to the My Grades tab over here, you can see that I have graded your proposal, and over here there's like a little icon, a little speech bubble that's highlighted. I can scroll over that and I can click that, and that'll just show your feedback, right? And so I've got content areas and feedbacks, like the two main sections, where I give you a score on one of the 4 different content areas. This is like if you want more information about that, right? It's in the syllabus. And then feedback. So what I try to do is I try to give you like 1 positive note and then 3 ways that you could improve this draft on revision. And so whenever you go back and do revision, what I'm looking for you to do is, how are they responding to these specific criticisms in the feedback? And if you want to see the draft itself, if you scroll over the title here, you can't really see it very well, but you can click on it, and it will actually bring you to this page where you can see it a little bit more in depth. And I can actually like leave comments on your draft, right? You'll see a lot of things that are like underlined, and you'll see, oh, there's a note on that. Well, this is a sentence fragment, right? A lot of my grammar marks are actually in this view. I can like sort of highlight stuff and like underline it with a little squiggly line and stuff. I can mark a word out if I want to. I try not to mark too much stuff out. And then occasionally, I don't know why it's not showing up, but I can highlight things and like leave a little note over here on the side. So you might even see some notes in the margin over here. I tend not to take, I don't want to like crowd your paper with it. But, there were a couple that I read over that like a lot of, a couple of students wanted all of a sudden to drop like 100 yous on me. And so I was like, I'll highlight every instance of the pronoun you. And if you want to revise it, take them out, right? Use a more objective point of view. We're trying to write this in the 3rd person. So, maybe I'll highlight the you pronoun and I'll say, see the feedback on formal tone, right? And then you can come over here to feedback and it's, oh, here's the formal tone note. And that's where I'll go into a little bit more depth about what I'm looking for. Does that make sense to everybody? Cool. Sometimes I find that people don't know that you can see all that stuff. So again, that's My Grades, the little speech bubble, just the feedback. Click on the name of the assignment itself. It's going to bring you here, which is like the comprehensive page. I will keep my previews. All right. So on that note, let's harken back. Let's talk about fallacies. So I guess it wasn't a couple weeks ago, about a week and a half ago, I introduced some fundamental ideas about logic and the difference between truth and falsity being properties of sentences, particular sentences, whereas arguments can't be true or false, right? They can be valid or sound if they're deductive. They can be strong or cogent or weak if they're inductive. And that's the kind of language we would talk about with an argument, right? Is this, what's the strength of this argument? Is this argument valid, right? We wouldn't say that it's a true or false argument. Fallacies are not arguments. There are groups of sentences that appear to be arguments, but they also aren't true or false. And there's some confusing properties of the fallacy that we'll talk about. So those ways of producing the false appearance of an argument depend on ambiguity. So saith Mr. Aristotle on Sophistical Refutations. The main ideas that we're going to talk about today in this set of notes are what is a fallacy, and then in particular, we're going to focus in this class on informal fallacies. If you want to learn about formal fallacies, you can take a logic class, and they will bore you to tears about the 6 kinds of formal fallacy. You can learn about material implication, my personal favorite kind of implication, and all the other different kinds of like logical stuff. And that way, informal fallacies are where the fun is, though. Formal fallacies are usually pretty obvious. I've got an example of one to kind of show you what those are. But informal fallacies are whenever we talk about, this is a straw man argument. That's an attack against the person, right? Those are the informal fallacies. So first of all, start at the ground floor. What is a fallacy? I define a fallacy as a defective line of reasoning. And importantly, it's not just a defective line of reasoning, but it's defective reasoning that appears to be good reasoning. Fallacies can be very persuasive. Just because something is persuasive doesn't make it true, and it also doesn't make it a good argument. It also does not even make it an argument. Again, fallacies and arguments are different things. Arguments can contain fallacies, but any argument that's going to contain a fallacy is going to be invalid. Because the presence of a fallacy in an argument means that the premise are not connecting to the conclusion. But this is where things get confusing. Arguments can be valid, or sorry, not in, I misspoke there. I said all arguments containing fallacies are invalid. An argument containing a fallacy can be valid, but they are always unsound, because ultimately the conclusion is not a consequence of the premises. Right. And this is, like I said, where things get a little bit confusing. Arguments can be valid, they can contain fallacies, and they can assert all true statements. Just because an argument contains a fallacy doesn't mean that those statements are false. So one of the fallacies we'll look at is called missing the point, non sequitur. And a feature of the non sequitur is just that the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises. All the premises could be true. The conclusion itself could be true. It's just that these do not point to this. Right. And that's what makes it a fallacy. It's not that, there's any particular statement is false, right? A false sentence is false. A fallacy is a fallacy. Sometimes there's overlap there. Sometimes there's not. Sometimes fallacious argument can only contains true statements, right? And that's why they're so difficult to spot. Because if you're sort of and we'll get into some reasons why people commit fallacies, they're not always necessarily intentional. They could represent sort of, confirmation bias or ideology. Like I said, while arguments containing fallacies can be valid, they are not good arguments. Deductive arguments containing fallacies are unsound, and inductive arguments containing fallacies are uncogent. And so that's all nice and good. There's 2 types of fallacies. Like I said, there's formal and there's informal. Formal fallacies are unique to deductive reasoning, and they violate a specific rule of inference. And like I said, there's about 6, I think maybe there's 7. I think there's something called the existential fallacy, which is, again, beyond what we're getting into. But these have very spicy names like affirming the consequent, denying the antecedent, and things of that. The fallacy of the undistributed middle. Really great scathing titles that are, I'm sure you just are dying to know more about. But informal fallacies, these arise from the content. And an informal fallacy is more about like violating the the conventions or principles or like the kind of the good nature of debate. And it's saying that, like, generally when you're engaging in argument, the idea is that everybody is going to play nice, and all of our premises are going to relate to our conclusions. Whereas, if you intentionally try to overwhelm your opponent, say, by deploying fallacies or being intentionally vague or something like that, that's generally seen as like a not great behavior. But there's nothing about an informal fallacy that like specifically always violates like logic in a sense, other than the premises don't point to the conclusion. But since in informal, speech and reason, we're dealing with like sort of a wild or more chaotic kind of language. It's not the orderly and structured language that we usually deal with in formal logic. We might actually disagree about whether or not a particular set of language actually contains a fallacy. Two people can look at the same argument and one can come away saying this is absolutely fallacious, and the other one could say that you're absolutely bananas. So it kind of depends on a couple of factors. But generally, informal fallacies, these are violating values concerning relevance, strength, presumption, and clarity. So what is a formal fallacy? By contrast, it can be detected by simply analyzing the form of an argument. For example, if I gave you the following syllogism: if Professor Morgan, well, it's not really a syllogism, but it's a line of reasoning. If Professor Morgan is a person, then he isn't a penguin. Professor Morgan isn't a penguin, therefore Professor Morgan is a person. This is kind of a version of, Deborah, I had asked you when we were looking at conditional statements about like, if the battery is dead, then the phone won't turn on. Right. And we had that discussion of like, well, there might be other things accounting for why the phone won't turn on. Maybe it's broken. Maybe it's not a battery issue. Right. So if you look at this, I think you can kind of plainly see that, like, just because you can prove that I'm not a person or not a penguin, that doesn't necessarily prove the statement that I'm a person is true, right? Because there's no clear relationship just by the definition of the words between personhood and penguinhood. So, and you could the great thing about formal fallacies is you could switch out anything in these terms and it's the same sort of reasoning, right? If now I'm at a loss. If Socrates is a person, then he isn't a kite. He isn't a kite, therefore he is a person, right? It doesn't matter what terms you put in there, right? As long as there's clearly not a relationship between those things, it demonstrates that just because you've proved the consequence of something doesn't mean you've proved that those two things are related, right? And so, like I said, there's only about 6 of these formal fallacies, and that's really more for a logic class. But informal fallacies are both more numerous and more difficult to spot and diagnose than formal ones because there's a subjective element to these, right? And so factors that can lead to informal fallacies include, you could just be intentionally being fallacious for the sake of being fallacious. Maybe you're just like ruthless and you want to win an argument, and you know that I can snow my opponent under by just completely derailing the conversation or muddying the waters or engaging in a whole host of probably unethical behavior that the logic police will never come and arrest you for. And generally speaking, we have such free speech laws in the United States that unless you're slandering or libeling a private citizen, we have pretty broad leeway to spread false statements and misinformation. I don't know if y'all have noticed in the last couple of years. This is why Alex Jones can generally get away with saying some of the crazy things that he says, although he is being sued for defamation because he made demonstrably false statements about private citizens. There's a little bit of nuance in there, right? So you don't have carte blanche to say kind of whatever you want. But there's this idea that, generally speaking, a society that has free expression tolerates unpopular and largely sometimes hateful speech that may contain a bunch of misinformation and distortions. So it could be intent, it could be carelessness. Maybe there's a fallacy in your argument or your writing just out of oversight, right? Same thing with plagiarism, right? Intent does not necessarily mean that just because you didn't intend to plagiarize doesn't necessarily mean that what you're doing is not plagiarism, right? It could just be carelessness. And like I said, ideology. Maybe if you disagree about the definitions of some words, and those words happen to be like ideologically charged words, like what's the definition of freedom and oppression or things like that, that might strongly color whether or not you interpret a particular line of reasoning as containing a fallacy or not. So it takes some interpretation, and any active interpretation is going to have some kind of subjective element. So types of informal fallacies, these are not exhaustive lists, but generally speaking, the main fallacies of relevance, missing the point. Some of these you might have seen in some context before. Some of these you run into on a daily basis. If you've ever seen any piece of advertising, you know what the appeal to the people is. It's the bandwagon appeal. You should want this because it is popular, right? Other people want this. There's some nuance to different kinds of appeals to the people, and the appeal to pity, right? The popular example for the appeal to pity is always the Sarah McLachlan song that used to come on at like midnight for infomercials for the ASPCA, where there was like a very sad song, and they would just play this montage of these horribly abused animals, and they were like, please donate to us, and they're appealing to your sense of pity to get your money in order, it might be for a good cause, but the argument they're making is the fallacious appeal to pity. You should give me your money because these animals are pitiful. Well, that's not actually an argument. That's just you saying that this is really sad, isn't it? Now give me money, right? That's no better than Alex Jones in a way, right? He's doing lots of ad pivots all the time. He'll say, Democrats are demon globalists, and that's why you need to buy my food buckets. Because whenever you're hunkered down in your homemade bunker in the apocalypse, you're going to need my food buckets, right? Same kind of appeal there. The straw man, if you've ever listened to anything political, you know about the straw man. This is mischaracterizing your opposition into something that is easier to beat back. Sometimes the straw man is called the scarecrow, right? It's just reducing your opposition to something that it's not quite saying, oversimplifying it, or maybe just outright distorting it. The argument against the person, this one often goes by its Latin name, the ad hominem. This is using insults to dismiss somebody's argument, right? This person's an idiot, therefore don't accept their arguments, right? That person may be an idiot, but that's not necessarily a reason to reject their arguments. It could be a simple case of reject their arguments, and they also happen to be an idiot, right? But it's the idiotness doesn't necessarily mean reject the things that they're saying. This is the even a broken clock is right twice a day fallacy. Sometimes idiots make good arguments, and that's no fault of their own, maybe, but occasionally it happens. So you can't use a character assassination as a reason to dismiss somebody, which also makes it really difficult, because if somebody, it raises the question of like, how do you engage with, a person like Alex Jones, who you think might be arguing in bad faith all the time? It's difficult. You have to take it on like an argument by argument basis. It makes it tedious, and it's very emotionally taxing. Appeal to force, sometimes it's called the appeal to the stick. Accept my argument or else bad things will happen to you. This is the popular argument of parents attempting to get their children to do chores or whatever else they want them to do, of police officers, of college professors attempting to get you to turn in work on time. Do this or there will be consequences. Arguments of fallacies of defective or weak induction. These are things like the argument from ignorance, the appeal to false authority. The appeal to false authority is a fun one. It's not necessarily an appeal to false authority as much as it's using somebody's authority as if that were an argument itself. A doctor said it, therefore it must be true. right? Or just accepting something because a doctor said it, right? Without factoring in things like, well, what are they a doctor of? What claim did they make, right? Is it reasonable for a doctor to say such things? Is this a radiologist commenting on virology or something? It was something we had talked about briefly before, right? The false cause, we've talked a little bit about that. That's a form of correlation doesn't equal causation. The hasty generalization, drawing a hasty drawing a general conclusion from an atypical sample or something that's actually not representative of the whole. Fallacies of presumption and ambiguity. Presumption are interesting. We've got the fallacy of accident, and which sounds more difficult than it actually is. It's misapplying a rule to a specific case where it clearly doesn't apply. The complex question and begging the question, these are often confused for each other, and especially begging the question, people use the phrase begging the question incorrectly like 99% of the time. It doesn't mean what most people say it means. If you ever hear somebody say something like, well, the good senator said this, but that begs the question, the good senator said that, sometimes it rains, but that begs the question of, does water fall from the sky or something like that? Usually what people mean is something raises a question. Like if you ever hear somebody say that something begs the question, followed then by a legitimate question, it's not begging the question, it's raising a question. There's a little bit of nuance in that. And begging the question is not necessarily a question, which is also confusing. Begging the question is known as circular reasoning. It's just that, I am cool because I am awesome. That's begging the question. Right? My awesomeness begs the question of my coolness. We have yet to establish my coolness yet. Therefore, we cannot use my coolness in service of proving my awesomeness, right? We have to do one first and then the other. Complex question is like, the popular example would be something like if I were to say, Deborah, have you stopped cheating on your assignments yet? It's a complex question. I've yet to prove that Deborah has been cheating on her assignments. It puts you in this kind of bind. If you say no, then you admit that you've cheated on your assignments in the past. If you say yes, or if you say no, then you're admitting that you're still cheating on your assignments. If you say yes, then you're admitting that in the past you've cheated on your assignments. You have to reject the whole question, right, out of hand. You would have to say, I am not cheated on any assignments, right? It's framing a more complicated question as if it were a yes or no. But answering either yes or no commits you to accepting the question at hand, right? Or it commits you to accepting a sort of a secret premise that's trying to be slid underneath. Fallacies of ambiguity. These include one of my favorites, equivocation. Using a word with two different meanings, clearly using both meanings in a different context. Something like, all plants produce oxygen. This plant is a coal plant. This is a coal plant, therefore this coal plant produces oxygen. I'm clearly using plants into like different meanings, right? One is an organic structure which uses sunlight to produce chlorophyll. Don't biology people, I'm sorry. The other one is clearly a factory for making stuff, right? So equivocation's fine. There's a lot of silly examples of equivocation, but again, right? Bernie Sanders in his argument often talks about free college. I think there's something to be said about, is Bernie actually equivocating on the idea of free? Is he, I think when he says it a whole bunch of times, sometimes it's not exactly free. Sometimes the way he makes it sound more like he's using free in the sense of like liberty than he is like no cost. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong about that. But a word like free would also be something that's like, again, these ideologically loaded words. If you have a different, you could see the name of North Korea is the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea, right? They might be equivocating on the definition of what democracy is. Like, might not exactly be what most people think of when they think of democracy, even though it might technically conform to like a dictionary definition. Composition and division, these are opposites of each other. They're a little bit complicated to explain, so I'll wait until we actually look at those. But that's, in broad strokes here, right? The big idea to take away is there's a whole bunch of kinds of fallacies. Some of them shade into the others, and the main upshot of all of these is that the premise are not related to the conclusion, right? That's the first question you should ask yourself if you're asking whether or not what I'm looking at is fallacious is, what is the conclusion, and do these premises actually suggest this conclusion? And then anything else is just extraneous. It's either rhetoric, it's pathos, it's maybe it's just style, maybe it's explanation, maybe it's not related to the argument at all, maybe it's seems to relate to the argument, or it's related to another smaller part of the reasoning. But how does the premise relate specifically to the conclusion? So let's look at a couple of these. So the big ones here, we're going to look at the missing the point fallacy, the appeal to the people, the appeal to pity, the straw man, the ad hominem, and the appeal to force. For a lot of this, I use Cohen copy and McMahon's Introduction to Logic. Fallacies of relevance are bald mistakes. They might better be called fallacies of irrelevance because they arise when there is no real connection between the premise and conclusion of an argument. Because that connection is missing, the premises offered cannot possibly establish the truth of the conclusion drawn. Of course, the premises may still be psychologically relevant, in that they may evoke attitudes likely to cause the acceptance of the conclusion. The mistake arises when some emotive features of language are used to support the truth of a claim for which no objective reasons have been given. This is another reason too why it's important to be on guard about distinguishing between the pathos of the language and the actual reasoning of the argument or itself, because something that might be psychologically relevant or pleasing to you is not necessarily the premise and the conclusion of the argument, right? And it might blind you to some of the more heinous examples of different fallacies. So first of all, we'll talk about missing the point. And the reason why I want to talk about this one first is because every fallacy is kind of a version of the missing the point fallacy. As missing the point just says that the premise don't relate to the conclusion. And some of these are more boldly obvious than others, but every fallacy is some version of the premise not supporting the conclusion. And this one goes by a lot of different names. It's also known as the irrelevant conclusion or the ignoratio elenchi, the red herring fallacy sometimes, like if you ever watched the old Scooby-Doo show, it was like when they were kids, there was always a character named Red Herring, and Fred always thought Red Herring was the villain, but Red Herring was literally never the villain, right? He was just a red herring, right? Whenever you're watching true crime, or not really true crime as much as like a police procedural, the first suspect is never the one that it always is, right? That's the red herring suspect, right? And that's the upshot of the red herring. It's, circumstantial evidence might point you in this direction, but the premises don't support the conclusion, right? And that's the idea behind like the red herring itself, and just like kind of all this. Or non sequitur, right? The difference between non sequitur and ignoratio elenchi is one is Latin and one is Greek. But an ignoratio elenchi is a mistaken refutation, one that goes haywire because the person presenting it does not fully understand a proposition in dispute. A non sequitur is an argument in which the conclusion simply does not follow from the premise. Thus, every fallacy is, in the general sense, also a non sequitur. So what are some examples of this? Professor Morgan knows a lot about comma usage, therefore Professor Morgan must be a reptile alien, right? Clearly no relationship between these two things, right? I might know indeed a lot about comma usage, but what relation does this have to whether or not the truth, if we're trying to establish the truth of whether or not I actually am a reptile alien, I don't know if my comma usage would be a strong piece of evidence for that. Now I've got this cartoon. Careful there, Mort, that's bleach. You don't want to get any of that on your clothes, right? Missing the point, right? Not the most important information contained in that, right? What's the more important idea in the drinking the bleach example? Why don't we drink the bleach?
It's poisoned.
It's poison, right? Doesn't matter if it stains your clothes. That's irrelevant to the fact that it's going to kill you, right? So missing the point. The appeal to the people. And, obviously, whenever you see these examples of fallacies in the wild, they're never going to be this clear, usually. Sometimes they are, but sometimes it's going to take a little bit more of digging, right? It's going to require you to have a little bit more familiarity with an issue to understand like when somebody is exaggerating or oversimplifying or something like that. But the appeal to the people is an informal fallacy which supports in which the support given for some conclusion is an appeal to a popular belief. There's a bunch of different ones of these. This is just called the advertising fallacy. This is a bandwagon, X, you should do X or you should buy X because X is popular. That's purely what the bandwagon appeal is. Lots of people are saying X is great, therefore X must be great. The appeal to vanity, only beautiful people buy X, therefore if you want to be beautiful, you should buy X. The appeal to snobbery, only the best people have X, therefore if you have X, you will also be one of these best people. And you'll often see a lot of these, this often works in concert with like the appeal to false authority. When Shaquille O'Neal is selling you Papa John's pizza, when Peyton Manning used to be selling you insurance. None of these people have any particular credentials. They're just they're appealing to celebrity popularity in order to appeal to your sense of vanity or snobbery, or I can be like this if I just get this thing, this product, this service, right? Least you think you are above the being susceptible to the appeal to the appeals of advertising. And also, as my logic textbook points out, it's the instrument on which every demagogue and propagandist relies when faced with the task of mobilizing public sentiment. It's a fallacy because instead of evidence and rational argument, the speaker or writer relies on expressive language and other devices calculated to excite enthusiasm for or against something. Some examples here. Lots of people are saying Professor Morgan is a reptile alien, therefore he must be a reptile alien. Again, right? Just because people are saying it, right? Maybe they have an axe to grind. Maybe they're trying to assassinate my character. Maybe they have something against reptile aliens. Who knows? But just because people are saying it doesn't make the thing true, right? It's the a million people can't be wrong fallacy. Well, as a matter of fact, a million people can be quite wrong. This is kind of a problem in a democratic society where we base things on majority rule, where a million people can be quite wrong, and sometimes a minority of people can convince an even smaller minority of people to do things that are quite incorrect. Anyhow, what I've got here is a Mercedes-Benz ad, and this one's, oh boy, this one's a doozy. Advertising is great. Men talk about women, sports, and cars. Women talk about men inside sports cars. The appeal to misogyny and the appeal to casual misogynist vanity. Right, you can tell a lot about the target audience of an ad like this, right? This is an ad that's not necessarily aimed at women. This is aimed at a particular kind of man who sees himself in a particular kind of way, say. Appeal to the people, right? That's like kind of all of them packed into that one. It's the appeal to vanity, it's the appeal to snobbery, it's the appeal to, it's kind of a, it's not really a pure bandwagon appeal. A more pure bandwagon appeal would be like, some kind of budget car, like, the Chevy Spark or the VW Bug, the car of the people, right? I guess it's not really the car of the people anymore. VW is kind of expensive. So it would be the Chevy Spark. When I bought my Chevy Spark, it was the cheapest new car possible to buy. And I was very proud. And then they discontinued it the following year. So that was also nice. Oh, I went backwards. The appeal to pity, ad misericordiam. Sometimes these, I'll put the Latin name for these at the end. Sometimes people who are really pedantic only refer to these by their Latin names. But we all speak English, so there's that. And it's also, this is 2022, nobody speaks Latin. This is a fallacy in which the argument relies on generosity, altruism, or mercy rather than reason, right? And it's not to be confused with the act of mercy itself necessarily, right? Because like, especially even in a court setting, mercy can factor into the mitigation or otherwise, it can be a circumstance that's taken into account, right? Like, whether or not to send a first offender who has no violent history to jail. Like we kind of talked about that example of that woman, that poor girl that was like brought up with Munchausen, or her mother was exercising like a Munchausen by proxy, right? The court did not put her in like, they put her on Rikers Island. They put her in like mental health care, or definitely locked away mental health care, but she's actually getting out relatively soon. So I think she wrote a book. So like the appeal to pity isn't saying that like pity can't be a factor, but the appeal to pity is saying like accepting or rejecting something based purely on pity and completely ignoring the premise itself, right? When the premise boiled down to no more than appeal to mercy, then that is plainly fallacious. So, things like, Professor Morgan may be a reptile alien that robbed this bank, but reptile aliens are pathetic, so we should just let him go, right? This is the appeal I would make, perhaps. Like, I'm just a poor reptile alien, trying to get along, trying to get a leg up in this world. And again, the ASPCA ad. This is a recent ad too. This is like they still do this. 60 cents a day. Oh, look how he's not the most pitiful dog I've ever seen in an ASPCA ad, right? And not to say the ASPCA might not even do good work. It's just that they're saying, look how sad, or in this case, this is kind of the appeal to cuteness, right? Look how cute this dog is. You want to help cute things, right? Give us some money, we'll help some cute things. And it's like, well, it's not really an argument. The straw man. This is a fallacy in which an opponent's position is depicted as being more extreme or unreasonable than is justified by what was actually asserted. So in controversies of a moral or political nature, a successful argument almost invariably requires some reasonable and nuanced distinctions, and perhaps also some narrowly described exceptions. The extreme position in any dispute, the claim that that conduct of a certain kind is always wrong or always justified. Are there any advertisements that are fallacious in some way? I tried to find an advertisement for each one of these, honestly, and are not fallacious in some way. Not anymore, I don't think. I think advertisement is almost exclusively about being clever, and being clever isn't about being reasonable. It's about being entertaining and likable. I think actually the more logos-based your appeal is, the more boring your copy is. So yeah, they probably, like, you can look at some old, and I've got some examples, some great old-timey cigarette ads that appear to be logos. They are very much not logos. They use doctors. Oh, they're great. My favorite thing is cigarette ads from the 1950s. Oh, they're beautifully horrible. But yeah, I think like you would be hard pressed to find an example of an advertisement that's not some kind of appeal to the bandwagon, or maybe a hasty generalization, or some version of one of the fallacies. It's a good question to ask whether or not like any copy is like purely logos based. I don't know. I haven't run into any that I can think of off the top of my head. But anyway, in terms of the straw man, it's often a fallacious device to contend with when somebody wants to words are hard. Therefore, the straw man is often a fallacious device to contend that what one aims to defeat is indefensible because it is categorical or absolute. I got my favorite picture of Alex Jones here with this tiny bullhorn, raising a big stink with this tiny bullhorn. He was at the green belt that day. Professor Morgan claims I should manage my time well, but he clearly doesn't want me to have any free time at all, right? You're clearly distorting my position when I'm asking you for what I feel like are some reasonable time management skills. If you think that Professor Morgan is a globalist demon who doesn't want me to have any free time and also buy my products and services. May I interest you in this purple mattress? So yeah, the straw man. And like, if you want a master class of the straw man argument, just listen to 20 minutes of Alex Jones on any given day. It's really great. It's not. It's horrible. It's a terrible experience that I wouldn't wish on my worst enemies. Argument against the person, the ad hominem. This one's got a lot of different forms, and again, politics are raft with the ad hominem argument. The ad hominem argument is to politics as the bandwagon fallacy is to advertising. You can't swing a dead cat in politics without hitting an ad hominem argument. a police officer told me something on this. You can't swing a dead cat in Pearland after 6 p.m. without hitting a cop. It was a very weird thing to say. It all has powerful descriptive language, though, right? Ad hominem is a fallacy in which the argument relies upon an attack against the person taking a position. And so there's three main forms of the ad hominem. The ad hominem abusive, this just attacks the person as a reason to reject a conclusion. Right. Katie thinks that, my water bottle is doesn't have like the greatest volume, of all the water bottles, but Katie is clearly a moron, and therefore nothing she says should be trusted. Right? Sorry, Katie, you're not a moron. Just because whether or not Katie's character has come into play, it doesn't. We're not talking about the qualities of the water bottle, right? What make it a good water bottle? It has nothing to do with whether or not Katie is a good person or not, which I'm sure she's a very fine person. Regardless, right? It has nothing to do with the conclusion, the evaluation of whether or not this thing is a good thing, right? The ad hominem tu quoque, this is the hypocrisy fallacy, the whataboutism fallacy. You should reject this person's arguments because they are a hypocrite, right? Really, an example that's really stuck with me about this one is a couple of years ago, there was this petition that went around on Twitter. A bunch of artists signed on to it. It was an argument about like free expression, that it was like, people shouldn't worry about cancel culture because artists need to freely express themselves. And whether or not your personal feelings about the idea of cancel culture, the idea broadly that people should be able to freely express themselves, I think, is a decent argument enough, right? It's a decent claim to get behind. But under it, one of the people in the comments had noted that, like, oh, well, J.K. Rowling signed this. Well, she hates trans people, so why? That's ridiculous. Like, this is stupid, and this whole thing is stupid. And it's like, well, J.K. Rowling might be hot garbage. However, she happens to be hot garbage that says a thing that's pretty reasonable. You don't reject what she's saying because she's hot garbage, right? Just because she doesn't, and this is, somebody, they did this to Elon Musk recently, which I'm upfront no fan of Elon Musk, but I was listening to a podcast, I think it was the New York, it might have been the Times podcast, but they were talking about how Elon was trying to buy Twitter, right? That's the whole thing right now. Elon Musk is trying to buy Twitter, and he's like, it's the new public square, right? Like, to me, that's a silly nonsense, but whatever. Elon Musk wants to promote free expression. An argument against this was like, well, Elon Musk doesn't even like free expression in his own business meetings. And they played a clip of Elon Musk, like, cutting somebody off in a business meeting and be like, that's a stupid thing. I don't want to hear that. And they were like, oh, so how can Elon Musk be a champion of free speech if he doesn't even allow people to express themselves freely in his businesses? And it's like, well, that's a tu quoque fallacy. Like, whether or not how he conducts himself personally in his, budget meetings might not have any relationship to what he plans to do with Twitter, whatever that happens to be. It might have some bearing on it because they're both, like, he would be in charge of both businesses, so maybe that's the case, but also how he treats his employees is going to be different than how he treats his customers, which is, if you're on Twitter, you're one of his customers. It's just an ad hominem tu quoque. If you want to argue that, Elon Musk is being insincere, I'm going to need to see some evidence that, like, he sent emails to Twitter and was like, I'm lying about this or something. Like, otherwise you're just saying that I need to reject this because, he's being hypocritical. Like, okay, well, just because he's being hypocritical doesn't mean that it's also broadly a good thing to champion free expression, right? Some more thing, poisoning the well. This one's a particularly onerous one. It aims to undermine rational debate by rejecting all conclusions made by an opponent after accusing them of intellectual dishonesty or arguing in bad faith. You shouldn't trust anything that reptile aliens say, or flat earthers say, is the one that I keep coming back to, right? It doesn't matter what flat earthers say; they're all stupid anyway, right? They're all arguing in bad faith. They're all ridiculous, silly people, and it's like, well, that's a poisoning the well fallacy. Like, occasionally they might stumble upon some points. just because they, make those claims doesn't mean that we should reject them out of hand. This is a particularly difficult one to navigate because if you are, engaged in debate with someone that has a history of, malicious intent, then the poisoning the well fallacy is a little bit more difficult to navigate. I'm not saying that it doesn't exist, but it becomes there do become times, and this is related to something we'll touch on at the very end called the Gish Gallop, which isn't as much a fallacy as much as it's just a strategy of overwhelming your opponent with nonsense. How do you confront somebody that is just kind of steamrolling you? It's not, the one way is to just not engage with it. But to say that, this person's arguing in bad faith, therefore anything they ever say can be rejected, strictly speaking, is the poisoning the well fallacy. And again, you look into any political debate, you're going to find all of these happening probably simultaneously, especially in the last 4 to 5 years. It's been particularly bad. But there's this nostalgia for a past that never existed whenever. Oh yeah, definitely. There's this nostalgia for a past that never existed when people were more reasonable to each other. I don't believe that this time ever existed. These fallacies are as old as civilization itself. Nah, I don't. There was a time when maybe we were nicer to each other on face to face, possibly. But even that, I don't know. I'm not really compelled by those kinds of arguments. Argument against the person. Professor Morgan is a dirty reptile alien whose arguments shouldn't be trusted, since we all know that reptile aliens just want world domination. And how could we let a shrimp like this run our great country? It's really funny because he's the literal shrimp, which is equivocation, actually, right? Because he's a shrimp in literally, but figuratively, like a shrimp is a weak and incapable person, right? So he's obviously invoking more than one fallacy in this particular scenario. Let's see. The appeal to force. A fallacy in which the argument relies upon an open or veiled threat of force. And this ad hominem, it literally means the argument to the stick. It is the walk softly but carry a big stick of fallacies. And it doesn't necessarily have to be like, accept my argument or I will hurt you physically. It could be more nuanced than that. It could be, something like, you should accept this position or, certain bad things will happen. Example I have here. If you don't accept that Professor Morgan is a reptile alien, you can be easily replaced, right? The passive construction makes it even more ominous. Who's replacing, right? Who's doing the replacing here? What does it mean to be replaced in this context? Or just physically taken out? Like, you gonna take me? You gonna shoot me? Like, what do you mean? Are you going to, I don't know, take my consciousness and upload it into a new sleeve and make me into a clone? I don't know. There's a lot of possibilities, is what I'm saying. There's the respect my authority. You tell me how old you are, they'll tell me how old you are. If you know this, character and season of South Park. All right, that brings us to a pretty natural stopping point. So what we'll do here, it is 6:56. So we'll take 10 and then we'll come back and we'll shift gears. Now that you have a set of fallacies under your belt, we'll talk about rhetorical analysis and we'll talk about the different appeals and how maybe some of these are more susceptible to, or some of the appeals are a little bit more susceptible to some of these than some of the others. So y'all go ahead and take 10 and we'll reconvene here at 7:06. Well, let's do 7:07 because by the time everybody buggers off, it'll already be 57. Welcome back to our thrilling conclusion. Our denouement. Well, actually, falling action. Denouement to follow. So real quick, before I put you far away from fallacies, I do want to take a second to talk about the next discussion board, which some people have already completed. Interesting. The next discussion board, and for the next few discussion boards, actually, basically most of the rest of them, I kind of want to get you into argument by like sort of backwards, by having you go out and find examples of bad arguments to illuminate maybe what good arguments are by contrast. So you're going to do lots of like fallacy finding examples. These could be, you know, they're set up very similarly to the other ones, right? These are free writing exercises. These are, I'm not really grading these for grammar. What I'm really looking for is finding a real world example of a fallacy and then telling me, you know, explaining why is this fallacious, right? How did the premise not relate to the conclusion? And you've got that that file of notes. Definitely this one and all of these, like the first set I'm asking about over the next about week or two, are all going to be finding fallacies of relevance, but definitely using this, right? All these different fallacies of relevance, I have like a definition. You've got some content about what these things are and some examples of what they are. And again, you know, advertisements, these are really good examples. You can, if you're doing research and you think that a particular line of reasoning is fallacious and you want to point that out and make an argument about why you think that that's fallacious, as long as you can demonstrate to me through your interpretation that the conclusion is not supported by the premise, or the premise don't support the conclusion, that's really what I'm looking for, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be related to your research project. Again, you know, ideally it would be. I would be really impressed if you could find every example of every fallacy in the course of your research. That would be a Herculean task, right? But you know, for these, you know, there's a lot of, you know, if you just go to Google, what I'll show you a couple of things. One are examples of what I don't want you to do. Right? You just type in like missing the point fallacy. There's a lot of like, you know, I don't go to Wikipedia and just find the examples that they use on Wikipedia. That's not really what I'm looking for. These aren't real examples necessarily, right? These are constructed examples. They're artificial. They're like the ones that I have in my notes. Similarly, there's all these different kinds of websites like changeminds.org that, you know, again, it's going to contain useful information if you want like some more background, but like I'm not looking for you to explain to me why this example fallacy is an example of this fallacy, because that's exactly what it was written to demonstrate, right? I want you to do some interpretation, right? Now, if you went to, say you went to the holy Google and you went to images and maybe, you know, there's like a cartoon that you can demonstrate why this goes in the direction that it goes and why it's a missing the point fallacy. You know, don't just trust everything that the internet says, right? The internet says that, you know, this is an example of, I don't know exactly what specific fallacy it's saying. What is this? The Penguins Fallacy. Penguins are black and white. Some old TV shows are black and white. Therefore, some penguins are old TV shows, right? That's an equivocation fallacy, clearly, right? But you could probably make an argument that that's another kind of fallacy too. Okay, no, thank you. You also get a lot of this nonsense, right? These like pop-ups and stuff. There's another website that like pops up a lot, Logically Fallacious. You know, this is really useful. It's got like a boatload of fallacies. If you go browse and search, you can see all sorts of fallacies that even I'm not covering. But it's got a lot of example fallacies that were like produced specifically to demonstrate. And one cool thing about Logically Fallacious, it shows you like the structure, like the logical form of like how the fallacy would like sort of how it works in the real world. And then he's got some examples. These are all these are artificial examples, right? This is not what I want you to find. to complete the discussion thread. What I want you to do is like, you know, I want to look up, right, like bandwagon fallacy. Again, advertisements are really good for this, right? If you want to find like a specific advertisement and maybe explain to me like, why is this an example of the bandwagon fallacy or something like that, that's fine. The drink everybody knows, right? Classic appeal to the bandwagon appeal. Oh, these are fun. Bandwagon fallacy. Let's see. Oh, I can't wait for the appeal to false authority. These are real fun. No, just show me the picture. There we go. 20,679 physicians say Luckies are less irritating, right? It's a clear appeal to false authority. The doctor says to smoke the Lucky Strike, so why not, right? Some of my favorites include the old Camel ones. Oh, this one's a good one. Man-sized satisfaction, right? Appeal to snobbery or vanity. Also, right, using the appeal of false authority. This is Frank Sinatra, right? Oh, Frank Sinatra smokes Chesterfields. Therefore, if I smoke Chesterfields by the property of cool people transposition, I am like Frank Sinatra, right? We got Ronald Reagan. Video is fine too, right? If you want to do a commercial, that's fine too. Commercials are really good for this. Ronnie Reagan pitching Chesterfields, a young, sprightly Ronald Reagan. This is an old one. This is from 1896. No, I'm just kidding. Where's the one? This one's fun. Not one single case of throat irritation from smoking Camels, says the doctor. These are so much fun. I love them. Let's see. Camel. There's one particular one that I've got in my notes. I can't. It was. I wanted to save it, but where is it at? There's the one. More doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette. Again, clear. Look how happy he is there, right? Who wouldn't want to have a cigarette from this, like, charming old man? But my favorite part of this ad is down here. For 30 days, test Camels in your T-zone. T for throat, T for taste. It's a T-zone, right? T for throat cancer, right? That one's fun. You can't really see, there's a little T superimposed over her mouth. The T-zone was apparently a big ad campaign for Camel back in the day. Like, I've seen so many T-zone commercials for them. It's fantastic. You know, Joe Camel. Hey, he's so cool, man. Who doesn't want to be like, his literal name is Joe Camel, or Joe, not Joe Cool. I want to keep calling him Joe Cool. Yeah. There's also, you can do a whole lot with cigarettes. Like, for instance, you can look at like different ways that they're trying to appeal to different demographics, right? Like, this is an older Newport ad, right? Oh, you know, it's appealing to your sense of individuality, right? Be an individual. There's a guy named Edward Bernays. I won't get too far off on this. He's known as the father of public relations, and he's also known as the man who got women smoking, because in the late 1920s, he noticed that there was this is before women could vote, and so, you know, Edward Bernays noticed there was an untapped market of first wave feminists that were trying to establish themselves as expressive individuals, and he was like, I can get them smoking cigarettes, because there was a taboo against women smoking cigarettes. And he's like, so Lucky Strike would sponsor suffragette rallies and pass out cigarettes, so that suffragettes became associated with cigarettes, and a cigarette became a symbol of like a liberated woman. Yeah, using your own autonomy against you to sell products.
This is cruel.
What could be more American? We love it. We love to see it. Anyway, find me some of that. Talk to me about those. Tell me why those are fallacies. And yeah, if you want to find videos, video ads are still really great. If you want to find old-timey advertisements, that's great. Political ads, right? A real famous one, LBJ Daisy ad. Oh yeah, all you gotta do, just look up the LBJ Daisy ad. And that's all I'll say about that. And also turn the volume of your computer down because it gets really loud. But it's a classic example of one particular kind of fallacy. If not, a couple of fallacies rolled up into one. Anyway, find me some examples of fallacies. I'm looking for you to stick to the fallacies of relevance, right? So that's just the ones that are in this PowerPoint on this list of fallacies, right? We'll have plenty of time to explore all of the different fallacies, right? But find me one, and then next week I'll ask you to pick from this list of one that you haven't already done, right? So we'll eliminate a couple, and then we'll move on to fallacies of weak induction, right? And that's what we'll sort of concentrate on with these discussion boards for the next couple of weeks. Any questions about any of that? Seem pretty straightforward. Fantastic. All right. So
I have a quick question. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Go ahead.
As far as like whenever we find whatever it is that we'll use for the discussion thread, do we cite it like a works cited kind of citation, or?
That's a good question. I would say I'm not really worried about you doing MLA, right? You don't necessarily have to cite it. If it's got language in it, put it in quotes if you're borrowing language from it. Like if you want to cite like a tweet or something like that, generally, since we're keeping all of this basically online, like include a link. Okay. Yeah, like do a little bit of description in your actual response, like describe it as much as you need to describe it, just to like get the idea across.
Kind of introduce it, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, I might go back and actually add that in to like include a link, because that would be a good idea. Or if you don't know how to put the link in, enough information so that I can like easily like highlight it and search Google and find it. Like it's probably not going to be too hard to find most of these. Although I might have to reactivate my Twitter account if you're linking to tweets. But yeah, social media is also a valuable resource for this. It might take a little bit of having to situate me, like explaining like, okay, look, this is the 6th response in a 5,000 thread long discussion in Twitter. So it might be a little bit hard to situate. So like it might be just a matter of like, linking me to the discussion and just like situating it like that, or like if there's a screenshot that you can link to or something like that. There's a way that you can embed a screenshot in the discussion thread too, but we don't really have time to get into that.
I have a question.
Yeah.
If the fallacy is a fake information, do we need to like a contrast with what is real or prove what is a fallacy?
So I would say that, yeah, if the fallacy contains like something that is demonstrably false, right, then sure, correct, point out like not only is this fallacious, it's fallacious and it's fallacious because it has a false premise or something like that. But also remembering that not necessarily every fallacy has a false statement in it, right? So just because you're finding a fallacy doesn't mean you're also like, if you're like, man, I can't find anything that's like proving any of these statements wrong. It might just be because the way that they're organized is the fallacious strategy that's being used, not that they're using misinformation or distortion, right? The straw man in particular is kind of the fake information, the fake news fallacy, right? That's like, oh, you're misrepresenting something, you're ignoring some nuance, you're not exactly saying everything the way that it should be said. And there's like a lot of questions of degree of the straw man too. So yeah, but if you find something demonstrably false, like hey, I went on Snopes, it told me that this was nonsense. Good questions. Anyone else? Fantastic. All right, let's talk about rhetorical analysis. And I'll try to walk and chew gum here. I'll like talk about these ideas and I'll point to some things in ye old Bernie and Walsh's arguments that I think are being illustrated, that I think that they're doing to illustrate the different kinds of concepts of rhetorical analysis. How did y'all feel about these arguments?
I was like fully agreeing with Bernie Sanders until I read Walsh's, and I'm like, oh, wait a minute. She's making some really good points here that I had never really considered. So it was interesting to, hear one argument and go, oh yeah, and then another argument and go, oh wait.
Isn't that infuriating? You can read one argument and be like, well, of course. And then you read something else that says something slightly different. You're like, oh yeah, actually maybe. Yeah, I think Walsh definitely introduces some good points that Bernie does not talk about. Although I'm less a fan of the actual argument being made in Walsh's, and I'll go into why that's the case. Although Bernie isn't doing himself any favors. I think Walsh, when we talk about like ethos in particular, Walsh is doing a much better job at like naming where they're getting a lot of their information. Bernie's just kind of like, yeah, I'm Bernie, just trust me. Which is, can be a useful strategy, but I don't know.
It's like Brooks though.
It's very much like Brooks, right? There was a lot more in their strategies that was similar in that way, that like, oh, you're making a lot of like, you're falling really heavily back on your own sense of credibility, right? Whereas Walsh, like, nobody knows who this is, right? Although, we can get a little bit of an idea of who she is, but maybe not. It's weird that it's a bad gateway. It led me to her credentials earlier, but anyway. We'll get back into that. There we go. Rhetoric may be defined as the faculty of observing in any given case the available means of persuasion. It's Mr. Aristotle again from On Rhetoric. And the big ideas we're going to take away here are rhetorical analysis and the three forbidden words, pathos, ethos, and logos. And I'll explain why I don't ever want you to actually use those words, but we'll get to that. Before we talk about Mr. Aristotle, let's talk about Mr. Plato for a second. If you've taken any philosophy class before, you might have heard of Mr. Plato, not just a flexible, malleable dough-like substance anymore, also a writer of some substance. He was a Greek philosopher. He was, strictly speaking, I think Aristotle's teacher, or at least he comes chronologically before Aristotle. He was definitely a pupil of Mr. Socrates. Mr. Socrates lived a little bit before Plato. Plato is kind of Socrates' biographer. Socrates is the classic, the narrative of philosophy of guy walks around and is really poor and annoying, asks a lot of questions, and then is sentenced to death. And up to the very moment of his death is a really annoying pedant about everything. He's the classical philosopher. We love him. But Plato was deeply suspicious of rhetoric. Plato didn't like rhetoric. Plato's got a lot of his own problems that we really don't have time to get into. But he criticized the idea of rhetoric in at least two works called the Gorgias and the Phaedrus. And one of the criticism that I really liked was in Phaedrus, Socrates and Phaedrus are discussing the definition of love. And Phaedrus is real hot and bothered because he was just in downtown Athens and somebody just made a blisteringly awesome speech about how, like, in praise of love. And Phaedrus is all about like, oh, Socrates, you gotta hear this speech about love. It's the greatest speech about love that's ever been written. It's fantastic. And Socrates is like, no, that's a pretty good speech. I'm not gonna lie. But then Socrates is like, I think I can do one better though. And so Socrates composes this speech about love. And Phaedrus is like, that's a pretty fire speech as well, Socrates. Isn't love great? And so Socrates is like, well, but check this out. I'm also going to now denounce love with just as equal passion. And he finishes, and Phaedrus is like, God, that was even more fire. I hate love, and love is terrible. And it's just the problem that Deborah was describing, that you read one thing and then you read the opposite thing and you're like, what even is truth, right? That's exactly Plato's criticism of rhetoric, is that Socrates imagines that there's a deceitful businessman and some potential customer who he knows is ignorant of the difference between a good or a bad product. And the deceitful businessman, Socrates reasons that by using persuasive language, the businessman can easily fool the customer by exploiting their ignorance, right? The example he uses is, I could sell you a donkey as if it were a horse, right? If you don't know the difference between a horse and a donkey, and I just said, I've got a really great animal, it's got 2 pointy ears and it walks on all fours and it's got hooves and it carries stuff. That's broadly equivocating between a horse and a donkey, right? And so you go and you ride off on your donkey and you think it's a horse, and people will mock you and make fun of you. So Socrates concludes that persuasive language can do great harm if it's abused by the unjust to deceive the ignorant. And that, especially in a democratic society, is a problem because, I don't know if you can imagine a scenario where, I don't know, some kind of unscrupulous character comes along and by using inflammatory and defamatory and emotionally driven language whips up people into a frenzy. What kind of terrible consequences could possibly come about because of that? What sort of seditious conspiracy could multiple people be charged with as a result of such rhetoric? So it's been around for a while. So that's just a criticism I'd like for you to keep in the back of your mind about rhetoric, since this is a rhetoric class, and we're operating under the principle that generally persuasion is a good thing. Can be, but it can also be incredibly damaging. So what is rhetorical analysis? It is a close reading of a text to examine how and if it persuades successfully. It examines how language moves an audience's emotions, which is the ethos, the pathos, how it gains their trust by establishing the speaker as a source of credible information, or the appeal to ethos, or how it uses reasoning, the appeal to logos, to persuade, or why and how that language fails to do so, right? This is what you kind of did in your discussion threads. You really were just boring down on one of these ideas. How is an author attempting to elicit a specific emotion, right? So in your rhetorical analysis that you'll be turning in later this week, you're going to be doing the whole shebang, right? It's what emotion is this language producing in me, the reader, and is the author successful at persuading me to accept what they say based on this emotional appeal, right? And now it brings me to a brief note about terminology. You're going to see me use the words pathos, ethos, and logos a lot. You're going to see them in my notes, but I would prefer you to refer to these as the emotional, the credible, and the rational appeal. Again, mostly because we're in the 21st century and we speak English, and these are all 5th century BC Greek words, which don't exactly mean the same things that we mean when we refer to these ideas. For example, I see a lot of thesis statements. The author used pathos to persuade. That's great. What kind of pathos is used? The author used descriptive similes to persuade, right? That's a more effective kind of, thesis statement that I'd be looking for. Saying that an author uses pathos to persuade is like saying an author uses ink and a pen to write. It's sure, there's no other way that you could kind of do it. You're using one or all of them. So to say that they're using pathos isn't really saying anything descriptive. But if you were to give me a specific example of something that maps on to the concepts behind pathos, that's really what I'm looking for. So, but if you were to say something like the author successfully appeals to the audience's emotions, I would much rather read something like that, because that's a little bit more descriptive than just saying pathos, right? Ethos, the credible appeal. Persuasion is achieved by the speaker's personal character when the speech is so spoken as to make us think him credible. We believe good men more fully and more readily than others. This kind of persuasion, like the others, should be achieved by what the speaker says, not by what people think his character before he begins to speak. His character may almost be called his most effective means of persuasion he possesses. I think this is a really important point. And I think it's Mr. Aristotle, very insightful. Sometimes a horrible misogynist, but occasionally very insightful. And I think what he's getting at here is it still resonates with such the ring of truth that it almost does. You could go out. Some people could just go outside on Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody, and they still wouldn't lose any votes, right? Just the idea that if people just think you're a good person, they'll believe the things you say. I mean, that's why Alex Jones has listeners. You should hear some of the people that call into his show. It's a roller coaster. And any more than the things that any individual says, like if you believe somebody is a trustworthy source of information, it's a very powerful tool. Also, I think the other important thing that he's hitting on here is that ethos is something that is established through the language itself. And this is always a difficult concept that, well, if somebody, sometimes when people are looking at ethos, they'll be like, oh, this person is a smart person. This person went to college, therefore they must know what they're talking about, right? Just because you've been to college doesn't prove that you know what you're talking about. All it proves is that you can meet deadlines in a timely fashion. Hopefully, it also means that you're relatively competent at what you're doing. But just because somebody has a certain set of credentials doesn't endow them with the ability to really say a lot. And sometimes the more inaccessible or sort of esoteric sounding someone's credentials are, that can actually substitute for actual credibility, right? If you see somebody as I used to have a reading where he was a neuroscientist, and he was talking about what his article was called The Politics of Fear. And one of the confusion that my students kept demonstrating whenever they had to read this and discuss this guy's credentials is they were like, oh, he's a neuroscientist, so he's got a lot of credibility. It's like, well, he's a lot of credibility when he's talking about neuroscience, right? But if he was started to waver and start to talk about, I don't know, history, economics, things that are outside the field of neuroscience that you don't get a lot of, you're not getting a lot of hours in economics class when you're a neuroscientist. Now that person should not have as much like upfront credibility as you would be maybe more charitable to grant them when they're talking about the thing that they have a narrow band of credibility in, right? You should want them to lean on the credibility of other experts, and not to just take what experts say at face value, like the appeal to false authority, but what are they saying, and how am I even supposed to be gauging if this is reasonable to other experts in this field, right? During COVID, we got a lot of this. And one of the things that was really infuriating, I saw this guy, his name was Dr. Scott Atlas. For a minute, he was an advisor to Trump, like for a second. Trump's advisors are a meat grinder. Any given day, it was a different set of a whole different administration. But this guy, he got Trump's ear for a minute, and he was trying to make this case in the middle of the COVID pandemic that we need to send people back to schools. And he was really leaning heavily on his credibility as a doctor. Well, his credibility was a radiologist, which is fine if he wants to talk about x-rays, but he's not a virologist. He's not an epidemiologist. He's not anybody that studies or deals with infectious disease. So, that credibility as a doctor, you've got to sway me by the arguments that you're making. And the arguments that he made were, none of them were like scientifically backed arguments about disease. A lot of them were very ideologically driven arguments about society and like why people need to go to school, because when kids are in schools, they're not being abused by their parents, and like all sorts of weird arguments, which is like maybe broadly true, but it's missing the point. It's not really relevant to what we're talking about. There seems to be, other mitigating circumstances that are keeping people out of these institutions at this time. And there was another guy, there was a lot of people that were like virologists and epidemiologists that were like sort of not being listened to. Anyway, so just the idea, the upshot here is that whenever you think somebody is credible before they even begin to speak, you might be more inclined to just believe the things that they say. And just because somebody possesses some specific credentials doesn't necessarily mean that they have credibility to talk about everything under the sun. Ethos, it comes from the Greek word where we get it shares a root with the words we get for habit and custom, character, right? Ethics, all of these sort of constellation of words in modern English come from share a root with the word ethos. It's the quality of integrity, credibility, or trustworthiness, knowledgeability, or authority established through the language of the text, right? And so that's why I say, like, you know, if you want to talk about someone's specific credentials, then that's fine, but just understand where the boundaries of those credentials lie, right? Whether, you know, if we're looking at Jennifer Walsh versus Bernie Sanders, right? Bernie Sanders is, you know, who is Bernie Sanders? General question, just from the information we're given right here.
A senator for Vermont.
Senator from Vermont, right? He's a politician, right? I don't know what Bernie Sanders went to college for. He doesn't, I don't even know what committee he's on. I don't even know if he's on like an education committee, right? All I know is he was a senator from Vermont. And he's running for the Democratic presidential nomination. And he usually caucuses with it. He's usually an independent, but he's like trying to get the Democratic nomination in this particular case. This argument's from 2015, you'll see, right? You know, so generally, I know that he deals with policy. He might be involved in passing laws about education. So, you know, maybe he has some kind of credibility on the issue, right? But he's definitely not an educator. He's not teaching in a school, and you know, he's not an economist. Right? You know, those two things are pretty clear, right? Jennifer Walsh. See if this will actually like link to it. Oh, there we go. Professor of political science and the dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences at Azusa Pacific University, right? So at least Jennifer Walsh she's an educator, right? She's not just an educator, she's an administrator. Now, we could get a little bit more specific. She's an educator at a private university, right? It's not a public university. I think it's a nonprofit private university. But she's the dean of a college, right? And she's not just any administrator. She runs the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. She is the highest ranking academic officer in that college. And she teaches political science. Again, you know, not an economist, but has some more practical, personal, professional experience in education that in this case, Bernie Sanders lacks. So just comparing them on that face, like, okay, you know, maybe what Walsh has to say has a little bit more practical applications. Maybe when Walsh is saying things about, you know, college graduation rates and retention, maybe there's a little bit more credibility behind those numbers if she's not citing her sources very well. I have some bad news about that, but in terms of, you know, just comparing their bona fides, right? This is before they've even opened their mouth to us, right? So, like I said, professional credentials, qualifications, or achievements can be an element, but they don't substitute for the authority established by the author's tone and their strategy. Like I said, specific qualifications doesn't grant broad immunity. So when you're evaluating ethos, you're examining how successfully a speaker or writer establishes authority, credibility with the audience. So we want to establish effective ethos through an authoritative and reasonable tone. Again, their credentials, but then, you know, using valid sources and using good reasoning that avoids fallacies, right? Arguing in a way that is, you know, making plausible claims, not being unreasonable. Conceding, you know, describing things in an objective way, maybe even conceding important points and ideas, right? I got some great examples of this in both of these, right? In Jennifer Walsh, this whole first couple of paragraphs, I think, goes a long way towards building her as an ethos, building her ethos and building her as a trustworthy source. She says the free college movement, fueled to a large degree by Bernie Sanders during his 2016 presidential bid, is a response to concerns about increasing college tuition rates, concomitant stagnation in federal and state grants, and a corresponding student loan debt load that has ballooned to roughly $1.4 trillion. The first thing that might jump out to you there, that what do you notice in this first sentence that you might recognize from Bernie Sanders?
She's conceding that there is an issue with the cost of college.
Right. There's a couple of these, this is something that Sanders mentions, rising tuition rates. Also, student loan debt, that's something that Sanders mentions. He doesn't really talk about concomitant stagnation in federal and state grants. That's just a fancy way of saying colleges aren't getting a lot of state grants and federal money, right? That has sort of flattened out. But the thing that I really zeroed in on is that the student loan debt is $1.4 trillion, right? Right here, Bernie Sanders says, with a $1.3 trillion in student loans, right? Like, they're not the exact same, but they're close enough. This was also written 3 years later. Maybe the student loans are a little bit higher. That's a reasonable discrepancy. So I'm like, okay, so far, no, not really a straw man, right? There's this idea of federal grants. I don't know where that's coming from. Maybe that's something, maybe that's something else. It's not something that Bernie says. Also, she doesn't say anything about unions and the importance of unions to like establishing good jobs, right? As an old guard progressive, Bernie Sanders got to talk about strong unions, right? Indeed, inflation-adjusted data provided by the College Board shows that the average sticker price of higher education tuition, excluding room and board, over the past 10 years has increased 32% for 2-year public colleges, 37% for 4-year public colleges, and 26% for 4-year private nonprofit colleges. In contrast, student financial aid has remained virtually flat. To cover rising costs, families have been increasingly dependent on increased institutional aid and student loans. At present, the combined average annual borrowing for undergraduate students and their parents is nearly $22,500 a year. In light of these sobering statistics, right? What does it mean to be sober? What does it mean to be sobered?
To take very seriously.
That's a good figurative way to use the word sober, right? It literally means to like not be what's the word I'm looking for?
Not make light of, I guess.
Well, yeah, not make light of, but I'm thinking more of like the sober drunk axis, right? If you are sober, you are not intoxicated. Right? It's more like David Brooks is like, oh, the hangover, right? There's no hangover here, right? These statistics are not a hangover. They're a sobering fact, right? They're something that is curing you of your intoxication, right? They're disabusing you of like notions. And again, taking something seriously. It's understandable why this would appeal to families with college-age students, right? So again, right at the beginning, she's framing the issue, I think, in a reasonably like objective way. She's not engaging in any fallacies or character assassination. She's not saying Bernie Sanders, that dirty leftist. She's not engaging in any like name calling or any of that. She's calling this a real problem that is, when you look at the numbers, concerning, right? And it's reasonable to hold the opposite position. I think that's going a long way, I think, towards building trust. It's establishing themselves as, okay, this is a reasonable person who's recognizing that there is a problem that people are responding to in the world, right? That's ethos, right? That's something that, like, the fact that she's a college professor isn't giving me. It's just from the way that she is using an authoritative, knowledgeable tone. Now I read this and I'm like, how knowledgeable this person is. Look at how they're responding reasonably to what sound like ridiculous numbers, right? Like, yes, this is crazy how, this is a problem that these numbers are as high as they are. Right, Bernie goes in a little bit different direction. In 1877, which, okay, a little far back, Rutherford B. Hayes became the first president to make a strong case for universally available public education. Universal suffrage should rest upon universal education, he said in his inaugural, adding that liberal and permanent provision should be made for the support of free schools. Hayes, a Republican, didn't worry that some poor kid might benefit from access to free stuff, nor did he believe that the children of wealthy elites should be excluded from the universal nature of the program. For him, education was the basis for full economic and political participation, and full participation was the basis for all prosperity. And education should be available to all, regardless of anyone's station. Now, Bernie's going a little bit different direction. And before I say anything else about Bernie, I want a note about these links. These are not Bernie's links. These were probably added by the Washington Post editorial staff. Bernie, because if you follow some of these, this one is a 404 error, so that hasn't been updated in a while. This is, he's quoting somebody. Hayes, a Republican, didn't worry that some poor kid might benefit from access to free stuff. Who's speaking in this quote? You should be confused. I had no idea. I had to follow the quote. it's a Bloomberg article about, or it's another Washington Post article about something that Jeff Bush said. This is not Bernie's own quote, right? Or this is not Bernie's own link. This is, all of these links are annotations added by the Washington Post staff. So, take these links with a grain of salt. They're not always a surefire indicator that somebody is, they're not always a part of their ethos, right? They could have been added by somebody else. Notice that Walsh has no links, right? You have to purely go based on what does she say her sources are, right? Which is a factor of both her ethos and her logos, right? In terms of her logos, it's going to be like, who is giving me this evidence? In terms of her ethos, it's like, what is that? Sorry, in terms of logos, it's what is this evidence? In terms of ethos, it's who is giving me this evidence, right? What named sources are giving me evidence? And in this case, Bernie is deferring to Rutherford B. Hayes, who is a Republican. Bernie's establishing himself as, he's positioning himself as, look, this is a problem that's bigger than political divides. This Republican said that it was important for all of us to have access to universal education. I'm an independent. I'm running for the Democratic nomination. Here's a problem that transcends political divides, I think is where he's going with that. Which, I think is kind of a mixed bag. I don't think Rutherford B. Hayes' Republican Party is exactly the same Republican Party that exists today. I think some things have changed in 130 years or so, 140 years almost. It's not the same party. Maybe historically related, but definitely not necessarily the same agenda. But this is him, I think, trying to inspire the idea of unity in his ethos. That look, I'm appealing to a problem that everybody that we can come together on. And let me appeal to this obscure 19th century president that almost nobody remembers probably. So again, there's a set of questions you can ask yourself here if you're questioning these ethos. Does the author possess any credentials? And we saw that Walsh has some credentials. But then asking yourself some of these broader questions is really going to get to the heart of how they're establishing ethos and how they're establishing what is their tone, right? And when we talked about tone, we talk about what's the quality that the author has for the subject, and what is the quality that they're trying to get you to feel, right? It's very much related to pathos, and in a way ethos and pathos overlap with this idea of tone. But it's how are they establishing themselves as trustworthy, right? How do you read the words and say, I believe these statements, right? So Sanders, like I said, he cites, if we were to look at some of these and compare how these authors are doing this, has the writer cited specific sources or made their sources easily available to the reader or audience? Again, ignoring the fact that these links are probably not reflective of anything Bernie is doing in this article, for just taking his signal phrases, right? X says this as an indicator of where he's getting his information. Well, quite frankly, I would like a little bit more out of Bernie, right? He's not really giving us a lot of stuff. He's giving, he's talking about, this is a really good example. As of 2013, he says by 1940, half of all young people were graduating from high school. As of 2013, that number was 81%. Well, I think Bernie could have told us where he got that 81%. It would be relevant to establishing his ethos rather than just relying on himself. Now, maybe Bernie sat on an education committee, so he has access to this information. I don't know, right? He hasn't told me that, so I can't make that assumption. I don't know where he's getting this number, right? Unless I follow this link. He's not doing anything in his language to tell me about that. So he's, the ethos is flowing very much from what I already think about Bernie Sanders. Whereas if I go over to Walsh, one of her, let's go down here. This one is the one that I really want to zoom in on. According to a recent study by Indiana University, only 30% of community college students completed their 2-year degree programs within 6 years. Then again, she cites down here the government of California's own scorecard that gauges something about student completion rates here. Elsewhere, she cites NACADA, the Professional Organization of Academic Counselors, for some information she gets from them. She cites the Manhattan Institute a couple of times. I have some thoughts about the Manhattan Institute, but there they are. She cites, some specific numbers from these university systems. She doesn't exactly say where she's getting them from, but I think it's not an unreasonable assumption to say that maybe she's getting them from these institutions themselves. There's a clear path between her claims. Now, she's not perfect, right? And there are points of her argument actually where she says things and she becomes a little cagier. For example, when she says things like, "These findings are consistent with research conducted elsewhere. That leaves me a little bit wanting more." Well, why vague all of a sudden, right? Why in the next sentence you're talking about the Manhattan Institute? Well, why couldn't you name what specific research if it's so powerful? Who did it, right? And then even with some of these, when she could be more specific about, according to a recent study by Indiana University. When was this article written? Who knows, right? By the time you get into the middle of the article, I've already forgotten, right? What does recent mean, right? This article was written in, I believe, March of 2018. What is a recent study? Is it the month before this came out? Was it 2017 data? Was it 2015 when Bernie's talking about? What does recency mean in this sentence? So that's a little bit vague. You could give me a specific year. Especially, there's no title of this study. If you search 2018 study by Indiana University on retention in college, you will find that it actually does not say this. So I don't know where she's getting her numbers, but it certainly is not from, if you just search Google for this, maybe it's this. No, that's from 2021. Let's just see. Study by Indiana University, college completion. I don't know when this was written. No, maybe it's that. That doesn't look like a study. This looks like a study. This is from 2007. That doesn't seem recent. Now all of a sudden I'm hunting around for, trying to get some information that they could have just as easily said, this is from 2021. That's too recent. Yeah, I don't know where it is. I did earlier, I found one because I was curious. I was looking around for it. I found a 2018 study from Indiana University that said that 60% of all students enrolled in a 2-year university completed their degrees within 6 years. So that's demonstrably false. So I don't know. The point is, this author is pushing the burden of proof on me to find their information rather than leading me to their information. So I think that, judging just by this, I'm on the one hand, I could say, while I think Walsh's strategy of naming more of their sources is generally positive, the numbers that I'd have to chase down for Bernie Sanders are, one of them is repeated, right? I've got the 1.3 trillion repeated in both. So that's 2 different sources confirming the same data. Then it's just a matter of tracking down a couple of these other specifics and, I could probably construct a question that I could get this answer from. But then, Bernie also says things like, scholars say that the GI Bill was a major reason for high productivity. Well, who? Which scholars, Bernie? Be specific, right? Specificity is the heart of persuasion. Don't be swayed by language that is vague, right? Again, this doesn't invalidate the things that he's saying, but it's lowering the quality of the ethos, right? It's lowering the quality of this, if I'm going to believe the things that this person is saying, they're relying much more on the fact that they're saying it than they are on showing me sources that are demonstrating this information, right? We could ask, does the writer demonstrate familiarity and knowledge, right? I think he positions himself as a trustworthy source. He claims in 1978 it was possible to earn enough money to pay for a year of college tuition by working a summer job that paid minimum wage, but he doesn't substantiate this, right? It's a little bit further up here. Says in 1978 it was possible to earn money to pay for a year of college tuition just by working a summer job. Today it would take a minimum wage worker an entire year. I have some questions about that, right? Is this part-time work? Is this not part-time work? Am I talking about the federal minimum wage? I assume I'm talking about the federal minimum wage, but there's state minimum wages that are different too. He doesn't substantiate it, and he couches his language carefully. It turns out that, this claim is, there's a little bit of nuance in here. The word tuition keeps getting thrown around in both of these arguments. One thing that I think that this author is doing a little bit better, especially up the top here, is specifying the price of higher education, excluding room and board. There are other costs that factor in to college, how much college costs than just tuition, right? Sanders's argument is that tuition should be free. That doesn't necessarily equate to free education, right? Also considering the fact that education would be subsidized by some sort of tax, your free public school system is still supported by taxes. You're still paying for it. Nothing's free, right? But greatly reduce would probably be a little bit more reasonable language, but that's not spicy. Nobody wants to hear about greatly reduced college tuition. They want free, right? Free sounds like so bold and so strong, right? But I like this idea of them saying excluding room and board. That's a little bit more specific. When Bernie comes down here and he's talking about in Finland, Denmark, Iceland, this laundry list of places where college tuition remains, where universities remain tuition free, there are some oversimplifications here. Denmark, there are many cases where tuition is free if a student meets very explicit criteria, but you can't just take a plane to Copenhagen and sign up for classes. Typically, if you don't meet the criteria in Copenhagen or in Denmark, your tuition is going to be about $8,000 to $21,000 a year. It's about commensurate with Texas State University. And that doesn't include room and board. Also, while it's true that international students at the University of Iceland don't pay tuition, there's an annual registration fee that's about $500 to $600, not including room and board and standard of living. So again, you can't just get on a plane and go to these places and just start going to college, right? Which I think is a little bit of the impression that Bernie is kind of giving about these places, that here's the places where you can, he even pivots. That's why every year more than 4,600 students leave the United States to enroll in German universities. Well, how many of these people are enrolled in American universities that are going on a study abroad program, right? They didn't just, not all of these students probably just applied to the University of Hamburg. Maybe a lot of them did, but again, not giving me a lot of nuance there. And so I don't think he's deliberately misleading about any of these. It's broadly true, the things that he's saying, but I think he's oversimplifying some things a little bit in a way that, I think Walsh is doing a little bit better of a job describing some of these education numbers. And maybe that comes from Walsh isn't so worried about making the argument by analogy. Look at all of these other countries and how they offer free tuition. And should we aspire to be like these other countries? Whereas Walsh is really focusing on American colleges. Although Walsh, and we're not going to have a chance to get to logos today. I have some problems about some things that Walsh are doing, specifically when Walsh cites Germany and Ecuador. Says in Germany, where universities are tuition free, only 28% of the general population has attained a college degree. In Italy, rates are even lower. Just 24% of the population has a college education. And again, where are you getting this information? Is this from the Manhattan Institute report? They say in 2016, the Manhattan Institute reported that college attainment rates were higher in G7 countries that charged tuition than those that did not. In Germany, what's the relationship between this information and this source? Is this source providing this information? That's kind of unclear to me. Whereas these 28 and 24%, is it even reasonable to compare German universities to Italian universities in this way? I don't know. You've given me no context. You've just given me a statistic and a country. I don't know anything about Germany and Italy. It seems pretty decontextualized. There's no sample of attainment rates for other G7 countries. Honestly, I don't know how many people, how does this compare with, the overall American universities, right? How does it compare to people that, start college and do, words are hard. There's no sample of attainment rates for G7 countries that do charge for tuition, right? How does Germany and Italy compare to where you do have to pay for college? Do they have the same kind of attainment rates? Are they significantly higher? What would it mean to be significantly higher? I have no idea. She's not contextualizing these numbers very well for me. It's just numbers in a vacuum. How do I know? Further, Germany and Italy could simply be outliers. When she arrives at her ultimate point in that paragraph, she's suddenly obscure about her source of data, right? Elsewhere, researchers have found that free programs lead to poorer attendance rates among secondary students in Ecuador and university students in the Netherlands. Why do I know that this isn't apples to oranges, right? How do I know that you can compare Ecuador to the Netherlands in this way? I have no idea. I have no idea what the situation in Ecuador is. I have even little idea about what's going on in the Netherlands, except that people ride a lot of bikes and they like tulips. That's about all I know about the Netherlands, and that's not coming from Walsh, right? Who are these vaguely defined researchers? How do I know whether she should even be comparing these things, right? And that's where we'll leave off there. We'll sort of pick back up with these ideas next time. I'll go ahead and stop our share there. I went a few minutes over, but I also started a few minutes late.